So thanks so much for joining us. And thanks, Charlotte. I look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Jen. I'm excited to be here talking about my favorite subject, composting. Jen mentioned that I've been on, you might recognize me if you've been on some other, watched some other webinars. I'm usually here with Our Water, Our World, with Suzanne Bontempo, talking about pest management. But this time all of it's related to pest management in general, but this time we're gonna talk mostly just about composting and how it's gonna help your garden. So today, we're going to talk about what is compost, why it's so awesome, some different systems, we'll talk about the steps to make the compost, use it, and choosing a system. And as Jen mentioned, I might pause at one point during the presentation if there are any questions. The first couple slides are going to be a little bit dense, talking about soil science. So I'll pause for any questions there, and then we'll dive into choosing a system, making the compost. So first, we're going to talk about what it is compost. If you're in San Francisco, you know the green bins, you put your food scraps in, but what really is compost? Compost is nature's way of recycling nutrients and material. Compost is the final decomposed organic matter. Compost is not the food scraps going into the bin, whether the green bin or your worm bin, whatever. That's really just harvesting the material. The final product is the compost. And I want to be clear that compost is not soil. It is part of soil, and we'll learn more about that next. And why is compost so wonderful? Usually I ask the audience here, but we're just gonna move through it. I'm sure you all know. Compost helps keep organic waste out of the landfills. We'll talk about why that's super important. It also improves the health and resilience of your soil. And it does play a role in reversing climate change. So first we'll talk about reducing our organic waste. So according to the USDA, in the United States, about 1/3 of all waste is food or organic waste. And that is a big problem because when organic waste goes to the landfill, it doesn't decompose. It's usually in a plastic bag or underneath something or just smothered. There's no oxygen, there's no life in the landfill. So what it does is it creates methane, which is 20 to 70 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. We really want to reduce our methane. And according to Project Drawdown, which studies climate solutions, the food that we waste is responsible for roughly 8% of global emissions. And when we're talking about food waste or other organic material waste, it's not just the food going into the landfill causing the waste. It's also the land that it was grown on, the water that was used to grow it, the labor, the energy, all the inputs used to grow it, and then everything that went into processing it, transporting it, preparing it, storing it, and disposing of it. So a lot of embodied energy in there going to waste when we don't use our food scraps. So, and right now, only 5% of food scraps are composted in the US. San Francisco does have a big part in that 5% because we were the first city to start municipal composting. But, we can all do our part to compost at home, increase our composting in our communities, share, make it at home, which is what we're mostly going to talk about. So while composting is, the theme of tonight, and it's awesome, and I'm going to tell you all about how awesome it is, the best thing, though, is to not have food waste. As I talked about, wasting our food is a lot of wasted energy. So we do want to compost when we need to, but what we really want to focus on is source reduction, and that's just not having waste. That is the best way to reduce our waste. So not overbuying in the grocery store, eating our leftovers, storing everything properly, getting creative with the leftovers can help. All those ways to just reduce our food waste altogether. Then the next best thing to do with your food scraps that you're not eating is there's a lot of hungry people out there, as we know. So if there's some food that we can share with others that we're not going to eat, that is a great way to divert it. And then after that, if there's food that's maybe not, safe for people, but it could be used, diverted to livestock like pigs or chickens, it'll be suitable for them. That is a great way and more efficient way to get rid of our food scraps. Then the next level of getting rid of our food scraps would be home composting, and that's primarily what we're going to talk about today. That is the most efficient way to compost, as opposed to, our Recology curbside pickup is an excellent, don't get me wrong, it's an excellent resource and we should all be using it when we need to. But that centralized composting is really, it's like, if you look at the hierarchy here, it's like 3 from the bottom. What it is doing, it's trucking all of our food scraps like 80+ miles away, using a lot of trucks, using a lot of energy to compost. Yes, it diverts a lot and it's an excellent resource, especially for people who can't compost at home. But if we do have the ability to compost at home, that's going to be a more efficient way to reduce our waste and reduce emissions as well. So before I dive into the compost, I do want to talk a little bit about soil, just so we all kind of understand how compost works its way into our soil and is part of the conversation. So what is soil? It is made out of 4 components: mineral materials, mineral particles, about 45% minerals, 25% water, 25% air, and about 5% organic matter. 5%, 5 to 10% is really an average of what's considered good soil. It can go up to 18, 20%, but that's really the limit of where soil becomes, or where the benefits from that organic matter, where they reach the end of the peak of the benefits. So we really want to focus on 5 to 10%. And what that organic matter is the nutrients, the food scraps, the plant material, organic material, the microbes, the invertebrates, both dead and alive. All of that living and dead material in the soil is that organic matter. When we're adding compost to our soil, we are increasing the organic matter of our soil. And then the soil texture, that is, if you go to a slope garden center and you're picking out a plant, you might be asked what kind of soil you have, because that's going to be a great way to figure out how your plant's going to grow in your yard. This would be that answer. Your soil texture. Is it sand, silt, clay, or a mixture of the 3? Sand is big particles with big pore spaces. Water and air moves very quickly through it. And it kind of crumbles quickly in your hand. It's hard to dig a hole because everything just kind of collapses on itself. Then on the other side of the spectrum, clay is very fine particles, kind of flat. They stack neatly on top of each other, don't allow a lot of air or water to infiltrate. You stick a shovel in the ground and it bounces back at you, you probably have clay soil. And then there's the soil structure. The soil structure is really how all of the minerals, water, air, and organic matter is kind of combined together into an aggregate. That picture on the right kind of shows a picture of good soil structure. You can see there's roots, there's holes, there's gaps for water and air to infiltrate, but it's still holding together. It's not a solid mass, but it's holding together. It's not falling apart in that person's hand, and it's nice, rich brown color. And just to share, you can't change your soil texture. If you have clay, you'll always have clay. If you have sand, you'll always have sand. But if you add organic matter to either whatever you have, it's going to improve the soil structure. So when you add compost or organic matter to sand, it glues the particles together, those big mineral particles, makes the pore spaces smaller so that water can still come in and infiltrate, but it kind of holds it there more. And so the water doesn't move so quickly through it. And so the sand particles kind of hold together. If you add compost to clay, you're going to be breaking up the particles, allowing water and air to infiltrate more. So either way you have it, you're always probably going to have it, that soil, unless you truck in other soil, which I don't recommend. But you can improve it either way with compost. And one more thing to cover before we keep diving into the benefits of compost is photosynthesis. We learned about this when we were kids in grade school, so I'm just going to review it for you all so you understand. So overall, photosynthesis is when the plants take the carbon dioxide in from the air, the water from the air and the soil, and use the energy of the sun to turn that into sugar or carbohydrates and oxygen. The oxygen they release into the air for us to breathe. Thank you, plants. And the carbohydrates are then used as their own structure. It's the leaves, the flowers, the fruit, the stems, the roots, the entire structure of that plant is made from that sugar or carbohydrates. Now, for a long time, people thought that roots were just kind of like straws sucking up nutrients and water from the soil to build that plant. But what's kind of come to light recently, relatively recently, is that plants and trees actually share their the carbohydrates or the sugar that they create through their roots. So they are not just pulling nutrients out of the soil, they're actually pumping sugar back into the soil as well. It's a two-way street. What's happening underneath the soil surface is that there is an exchange between the microbes, fungi, bacteria in the soil, and the roots, the plants and the root systems. So the roots are creating, or the plants are creating sugars, and then they're sharing 20 to 80% of those sugars that they don't need down into the soil to feed the soil organisms. The fungi, the bacteria, the microbes eat that sugar, and then in exchange, the fungi, bacteria, or microorganisms are bringing the plant and feeding the plant nutrients and water. So there's an exchange. This is why we always talk about, in other webinars, you focus on the soil health, because if there's no life in the soil, you can't feed your plants. Plants can't take up those nutrients in the soil on their own. They need that life, those soil organisms, to feed them. It is just like our gut. We have organisms, microorganisms in our gut that break down the food and feed us nutrients. We can't digest the food without them. And it's the same exact thing in the soil. And that picture on the left where you can see the roots, but then they have fuzzy white ends, that's just showing what's called mycorrhizal fungi. There's this white webby fungi that moves throughout the soil, locks into plant roots, and just really, it's like they act as extensions of the roots. They're reaching out further to get nutrients and water from further away. In exchange, they're getting sugar from the plant. They're giving the plant nutrients and water. It's a really wonderful exchange. And I just want to share, when we're adding compost, we're increasing the life, the organic matter in the soil, which will lead to greater plant growth and more photosynthesis. So I've kind of given a little overview of why compost is so wonderful, but map it out for you. It improves the soil structure. As I mentioned, adding it to either sandy or clay or anything in the middle kind of soil will improve the soil structure and how the minerals hold together. It increases water retention in the soil. Compost can hold 5 times its weight in water. So really important. At our Water World, we always talk about compost as drought insurance. We're adding organic matter to the soil. It's going to make our soil be able to absorb water easier and hold on to it longer, which is so important in our summer dry climate. It increases the microbiology in the soil, which will improve or allow your plants to receive more nutrients and photosynthesize more. It recycles nutrients from plants and food scraps that have already grown. It filters out pollutants from urban runoff. Compost in the soil will lock in the pollutants and not let it move through the soil to the aquifers, so it actually cleans the soil. It can filter out 60 to 95% of urban stormwater pollutants. And it supports the overall health of the garden to prevent and fight pests. So actually, even compost adds good bacteria to the soil and good organisms in the soil, and those can actually fight off bad bacteria or pathogens that come into the soil. So again, more diversity, more life in the soil is going to help balance out the health of the garden. And then I do want to touch on something that I get really excited about, that how compost is actually a climate solution. So as I mentioned, all of the benefits to your garden before, all of these also lead to increased carbon drawdown and sequestration. So when your plant can photosynthesize more and pump those sugars down into the soil, that's carbon drawdown. That photosynthesis is the process of carbon drawdown. It's pumping carbon, which is sugars, carbohydrates, into the soil. When it can lock down in the soil, in the fungi, the bacteria, the microbes, and it stays there, that's sequestration. It reduces our inputs made from fossil fuels if we're not using our chemical fertilizers, and instead we're using compost. That is going to reduce our inputs. Healthier plants also don't have as many pests, so we won't have to use pesticides. It builds resilience against drought and flood. As we saw in the recent weeks, we can receive a lot of rain all at once. And when you have soil that's basically a sponge that's able to receive lots of water at once, it can infiltrate quickly and it can hold on to it. That is resilient soil. It's going to reduce flooding, it's going to reduce urban runoff, and it's going to hold on to that water for the drier months. And through that resilience, it will protect against soil desertification and erosion. And as I mentioned, it reduces stormwater runoff and filters out pollutions. One last point, I know it was kind of heavy at the beginning. We'll talk about making compost very soon. One project, the Marin Carbon Project, did a study on adding compost to rangelands, which is like areas where cows graze. They found that a single application of a 1/2-inch layer of compost, so it's just a 1/2-inch layer of compost on the grazed rangelands, can significantly increase forage production. So that would be like grass production by 40 to 70%, can increase soil water holding capacity. So that's the ability that soil can the ability of the soil to hold water by 26,000 liters per hectare, which is about 2,000, almost 3,000 gallons per acre. It increases soil carbon sequestration by at least 1 ton per hectare. 1 hectare is about 2.5 acres per year. And just to give a little bit of perspective, a 3,000-mile round trip flight, like from here to Boston, or a little bit further than Boston, but emits 1 ton of CO2 per passenger. So if we are sequestering that amount per 2.5 acres across the state of California, that's pretty significant increase. And I will note that this is found for a 1/2-inch layer of compost. All of this happens for 30 years without reapplying that layer of compost. It's a lot of numbers, but it's pretty cool. And then this is a quote from an article written about this project. They found that California has 56 million acres of rangeland. That's the single largest type of land use in the state. If compost made with manure was applied to just 5% of that area, they calculated it would offset emissions from about 80% of the state's agricultural sector. All of the cows raised, crops grown, fertilizer applied, and tractors driven in California. And I recommend, if you're interested in this, reading the article, Can Dirt Save the Earth? From the New York Times from April 2018. I can try to have Jen send out a link later if that's helpful. I will pause if there's any questions about that before we go into making compost.
Yeah, oh my gosh, that is really incredible, those numbers.
I know they're kind of hard to understand, but like it's big.
Yeah, that's massive. Even just a ½ inch, like you said, that's incredible. So, I mean, it really just, I think it illustrates the power of compost very well. And I love how plants share their sugars. I know you told me that before, but I think that's really cute.
Yeah.
So we have a couple good questions real quick. Is there benefit to add, like when you were talking about soil texture, is there benefit to adding sandy soil to clay soil to help lighten it up at all?
Not that I know of. I would say just sticking to the organic matter and just continually like just working in that organic matter. It's not really,
I've heard that it can turn it to concrete, like, because if you add sand to clay, that can almost make it harder. That's what I've heard.
That sounds right. Yeah, I don't think it's not going to add any. It's like sand isn't really going to open up it's not going to aerate. That only comes from the organic matter. So I would say no. Focus on the organic matter.
Mm-hmm. And then the hyphae, is that the mycorrhizae? Is that visible to the eye? The fungus in the soil?
I think it is sometimes if there's a lot of it. Like if you've ever dug into like really healthy soil, you'll see the white webbing. Sometimes that is, it can be.
Yeah, I've definitely
like
seen it before.
Not the individual strands, maybe not necessarily, but when it's like really thick and in a chunk, you can see it.
Yeah, and it's the kind of thing that once you're aware of it, you'll notice it. Like now that you know it, you'll probably see it when you go, like when you take a plant out of the container, a lot of times you can see it right there, or when you go dig in the ground, a lot of times you can see it.
Yeah, it looks like roots, but it's really fungus. So
like fuzzy roots or something.
Yeah, exactly.
And then this is a really good question too, because I think we're all kind of obsessed with the last couple slides that you just showed, but what is currently the practice that spreading compost would replace? So is there something that is being done, or what is being done currently that
like on rangelands?
On the rangelands,
I guess,
or is it like nothing?
It depends on who's managing the rangelands. Because I would assume they're all managed by different ranches and landowners. Some people, I mean, I don't know if I can't say for sure, but I assume some people somewhere, maybe not in California, spray chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Some people do nothing. They just let the cows, roam and poop and pee, and that's fertilizer enough, which in certain cases it is. So I can't say for sure what is happening. But I do know, I would encourage people looking at the Marin Carbon Project to learn more about what they're doing. My guess is that most rangelands, there's nothing happening. Like there's nothing actively being done.
Okay. And I'll see if I can find the link and I'll put it in the chat while you're talking. And then also when you put the compost down, is it just on the top of the soil, or are you mixing it in to the top layer?
I will touch on that a little bit later on how to apply the compost. You can put it just right on top, or you can mix it in, or you can put it on top and then cover mulch. I would probably recommend covering it just so it doesn't dry out. But you can do it in lots of different ways.
Okay, good. I think we should move on so we can get into the the composting part, and then we'll save more questions towards the end.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so now we're going to talk about choosing a system, and I'm only going to talk about a couple of systems. There's a lot of different ways to make compost, so these are just kind of like the general ideas. So first is our hot composting you might have heard of, or it's called active composting. Often it's in a 3-bin system, but you could also have a 10-bin system. You can do hot composting in 1-bin system. It's not as easy, but it's possible. So, but this is just examples of what people you might have heard about. This compost bin is at the Garden for the Environment in the Inner Sunset. I encourage you to go there, and if you want to learn more about composting in person, I've also taught there. It's where I've learned most of what I know about composting, so highly recommend going there. I do want to share that this is called hot composting because heat is created by the decomposers, the microbes, the fungi, the bacteria. We're not adding heat to it. And also, this is a primarily not involving worms. I know people think about worms a lot when they think about compost, and worms do play a part in composting, but most of the breaking down actually comes from bacteria and microbes. Then there is cold composting, passive, single bin system, compost pile. They're kind of, again, they come in different forms, different names. And they can look like a lot of different things. This is more, it's not going to get as hot. It might get a little hot depending on how much effort you put into it. But it's more just kind of, a place to put your scraps, and we'll talk about what you can do to it to make it a little bit more active. And some people have a bin. I have a bin like the one on the left. My mom has the bin like the one on the right. Some people you can make, your own with pallets, or you can just have a pile like in the bottom. I don't recommend just having an open pile in an urban area, especially if you're using food scraps. Just because vermin, rats. Then there is worm composting. Usually when we're talking about worm composting, it's pretty specific, using worms to break down our food scraps. You can buy worm bins, or you can make your own. Like on the left, there's just a Rubbermaid tub with some holes drilled in it. Easy, super easy. You can make one of those. I have one that's a little similar to the black stacked one. That's just, lots of different layers, and it collects the water or the liquid on the bottom. Beautiful fancy wooden ones, or you can go for an industrial one like the one on the right. That's made by a company called Common Compost. They actually make industrial size worm bins for like HOAs, community centers, schools, things like that. When we're talking about worm composting, we're focusing on the worms. Those are the composters, and we're only feeding them food scraps and a couple of other carbon materials. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to compost with worms later. Then there's as I mentioned, there's so many other methods for making compost. I'm not going to talk about these systems, but you can kind of get the idea through talking about the other processes. There's pit or trench composting, which is literally just digging a hole in your yard and putting your food scraps in and letting them, the microbes do their thing in the ground. Sheet composting or green manure. So that's kind of when you plant your cover crops, and then in the spring you chop them down, dig them into the soil. Bokashi composting is a way of composting food scraps with using this brand Bokashi material. It's more fermentation. So you're kind of fermenting the food scraps, and then once they're fermented, you will need to either dig them into the ground or put them into a compost pile before they're ready for using on the plants. But bokashi is a great way if you do want to compost food scraps and like meat or dairy or oily products. That can be done with bokashi. All right, so making compost in general, again, compost is a natural process. It happens on the forest floor when leaves land on the ground, microbes eat up the leaves, break it up, put it into the soil for the plants. But we're as composters, we're helping speed up the process. We're chopping the material, maybe. We're building a container or a venue, an environment for the material, and we're monitoring the conditions so they're optimal. I like to think of us as hosts of a party. We're going to supply the food, the venue, and we're going to invite the FBI, the fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates. The 5 main ingredients to compost are nitrogen or greens, carbon or browns, water, air, and living organisms. And the living organisms, as I mentioned, FBI, fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates. It's the micro and the macrobiology. And for water, I might mention this again later, but got to mention a couple times. We do want water, make sure our compost is moist. We like to have it about as moist as a wrung out sponge. All right, so our 2 main ingredients here are nitrogen or green material. Now I will share not all green material is actually the color green, but it just gives you an idea. It's fresher, it's wetter, and it's just kind of an idea, a way to think of your different materials. So green leaves, cut grass, really green, fresh things. Then we have our fruit and vegetable trimmings. A lot of our food scraps are high in nitrogen. Manure from, again, not green, but it is considered a green. Cow, horse, rabbit, poultry manure, and coffee grounds, great high nitrogen ingredient. When we're talking about manure, though, we are not talking about pet waste, no dog and cat poo. That should go in your black bin, the landfill bin always. It is, I will say it is possible to compost your pet waste, but I would not recommend doing it in your compost pile that you're going to spread on your veggies. And I would do a little more research on it, especially if your dog or cat takes a medication of some sort. It can, the poop itself can carry pathogens and bad bacteria. And of course, we also don't want the medication getting into our soil as well. So hold off on that. Read more about that if that's something you're interested in. And then I do want to share also where I mentioned cow, horse, rabbit, and poultry manure. I can't say that it's only vegetarian manure because poultry, like chickens, do eat bugs and non-veggie things. But it is primarily that. I do know that at the GFE, the Garden for the Environment, they take pigeon manure. The pigeons, though, are raised by a neighbor. They're like racing pigeons, so they're healthy. They're not just like street pigeons. They have a healthy diet, so they take that manure. There is a place in Oakland that takes the Oakland Zoo elephant manure and uses that for composting. So generally vegetarian and chicken manure. And then our carbon, our browns. So these are more woody, dry materials. Again, not always brown, but you kind of gives you the idea. It's going to be woodier, drier, harder. So we have our dead, dry leaves, woody sticks, twigs, and branches, untreated sawdust, straw, newspaper, and cardboard. So here are our basic steps. This is primarily for active composting or called hot composting. These are the steps you can do also with if you have a single bin or just a pile, you can do these steps with that. It's going to increase the temperature and speed it up. So we're going to collect the materials and chop it. Let's see if I can. Oh, sorry. I'm trying to play this little video here for you. We're going to collect the materials. We're going to chop it. Chopping just breaks up the materials smaller, so it's more surface area and it's easier for the bacteria and everything to eat it. And then we want to layer our greens and browns. Generally, our recipe is 1 part greens to 2 part browns. We don't want it too much food or too much wet stuff, or it's going to get stinky. And too much dry stuff or browns is going to just make it really slow to break down. So if you can do 1 part greens to 2 part browns, to start, that's great. And then of course, check as you go, make sure the moisture levels are good. Then we're gonna, you can layer in manure. If you you don't need to use manure. Manure is just a great way to increase the bacteria and the microorganisms in the soil. Here, I'm just gonna play the little video of watering it. If you don't want to use manure, I know some people do like veganic gardening. You can use already composted compost. So get it from a friend. It's kind of just a way to kickstart the bacteria in the soil. But layer in manure, the more manure you add, it will increase the process, but you can also just do, if you get 1 bucket full from a local stable, dump that in, that's really gonna kickstart the process. Then you're gonna add water as needed. I do recommend if you're layering, just make sure you're watering every layer and check, you want it moist as a wrung out sponge. Then we are going to monitor, turn the pile occasionally. Turning the pile just brings in the oxygen. If everything sits for a long time, only parts of the pile are going to get broken down. So when we're turning it, we're kind of mixing the material evenly, mixing the microbes evenly, and we're aerating it, adding that oxygen, which that life needs to do their job. It might get hot if you're doing it right. It could, if you're doing it, actively, it could get hot. I know at the GFE, it can get up to like 150 degrees, which is pretty cool. That's a great temperature to get to. And it'll stay hot for a while, like a month or so, and it kind of goes up and down. If you're doing hot composting, it'll kind of go up and down. If it goes, it'll go up at first, and then if it comes down, you can pull it out and turn it, and then it'll probably heat up again, and it'll kind of come down. It's going to go up and down a lot, the temperature, until it kind of slowly just gets back to air temperature. That's when it's pretty much done. So the whole process takes about 3 months, again, depending on how much material you have, how active you are being with it, how much life, and also the temperature. When it's colder outside, things slow down, and when it's really hot too, things slow down. So kind of that perfect San Francisco weather is actually perfect for it. We'll know it's done when the material is brown and unrecognizable. If you can still see like a bit of a flower, that means it's not done yet, and it should smell like the forest floor. You can sift the finished compost. That's what they do at the GFE. You can sift it out to kind of pull the the big sticks out that haven't been fully composted yet, and leave like a nice, easier to work with material, shown in this little video here. That's the finished sifted compost. Really, there's a couple sticks in there still, but really going to be easy to mix into your soil. When you sift, if you do choose to sift out the larger pieces, you can either put those larger pieces back in the compost pile to continue to be broken down, or you can use it as a nice mulch on top of, around fruit trees. It'll act as a wonderful mulch, and it'll also add nutrients to your soil. So I just want to share, we're actually going to move to worm bin, but I do want to share that. So that is the basic like aerobic composting process. The more active you are if you have a lot of material all at once, you're adding the right ingredients in the right ratios, keeping it moist, keeping it aerated and turned, it's going to be really fast. If you don't have the time, energy, space to do a couple of bins, or you just have, you don't have the material to build one really big bin at once, you can just add as you go, and you can do what you can. You can chop it, you can turn it occasionally, you can keep it moist. It's just not going to break down as fast, but it's still going to be beautiful compost whenever you're ready, whenever it's ready. If you can do nothing. You can just throw your food scraps and your lawn, your yard waste into a single bin, never mix it, never touch it. And it could, honestly, if it's going to be an open bottom, probably, and it will probably break down in about a year, and you'll have beautiful compost at the bottom. It's just going to take longer. Okay, we will talk now about worm bins. Switching gears here, that's a picture of my worm bin actually. We first, I'm going to go over these steps twice because I'm going to go over them here and then I have a short video for you to show you. We're going to make or buy a container. This container that I have is called a can o' worms. I think it's about, I want to say like 150. I don't know. You could look up can of worms. There's also like worm hotels, and you can find a lot of different kinds of worm bins on the internet if you want to buy one. Or of course you can get a Rubbermaid, tub, dark. You want it to be a dark color, black or dark blue. Worms don't like light. And just, poke some holes, drill some holes in the top section. And boom, that's your container. It's a single layer bin right there. You're going to add bedding. Worms like a carbon-based bedding, so that could be coconut coir, which you can buy in blocks at Sloat. You can use, newspaper ripped up and moistened. We do want it moist though. Sawdust, untreated sawdust can work as well. We want it moistened. Then we're going to chop our food, maybe if you want. Again, chopped food will just break down faster. But if you don't want to, that's totally fine. We're going to add it to the bin. Then we're going to add our worms. You can buy worms at a hardware store. You can buy them online. What I recommend is asking around to friends who might have a worm bin. Usually if someone's had a worm bin for a couple years, they have thousands and thousands of worms and they're happy to give some of them away. And all you need really, what I recommend is about a pound of worms, which is about 1,000 worms to start off with. That's like a good amount to kind of break down a certain amount of food quickly. You're going to monitor, you're going to add food regularly. I'll talk about how much they eat in a couple slides. And then when the bin is kind of full, you're going to harvest the castings. So again, I didn't really share this tidbit, but when we are working with a worm bin, what we're harvesting, what we're using is the worm castings or the worm poop. That is that black gold, that amazing nutrient-rich material that we want to put in our soil. So to harvest, there's a few different ways to do it. I'm going to cover it very quickly here, but I recommend, looking it up. I'll recommend a book to you at the end to read about this. But really what you're doing is you're just trying to get the worms away from the food and away from the castings. So you can either do that if you have a multi-layer bin like I have, and your food, the layer that you want the worms to leave is on the top. Just open up the top, the sun will come in. They don't like light, they're going to go down into the next layer and just get out of that sunlight. If you have a single layer bin, you can just kind of push all the castings to one side and start feeding on the other side, and then the worms will move towards the food. So they don't like light and they like food, so use that to move them to where you want them to go. And just to review, I'm going to show you a little video I made about building a layer in your worm bin. There's no sound, but I'll walk you through it. So you're going to moisten the bedding. I'm using coconut coir here, letting it soak. You can also use leaves, brown paper bags, newspaper, collect some veggie scraps, chop them. Sometimes I put them in the blender. Make a little smoothie for the worms. They eat it really fast. They do like eggshells and coffee grounds. We're going to spread out our moist bedding. We're going to add our food, our little smoothie for them. And then I'm taking worms from another layer, just dropping them in, just a couple. And then I'm going to cover them up because again, they don't like light. Usually I put actually a layer of cardboard or newspaper on top of that too, just to really protect them from the light. And what I did there is, so I had kind of a finished layer and I wanted to create a new layer. So I just took 1 scoop of worms and put them in that new layer. And I kind of just let the worms find, the rest of them just kind of find that new layer. So they're all going to move out of the old layer and move into the new layer where I'm feeding them. Couple more notes on worm bins. We are going to use, it's recommended to use a species called Eisenia fetida. They're called red wigglers. They're just the most efficient eaters and decomposers of organic material. They're also, they kind of live in the top couple of inches of soil anyway. Night crawlers, like the big fat ones that you get for fishing, they like to be deep in the soil, so they're not going to do well in a worm bin. The red wigglers really just need a couple of inches of material to live in. They're happy there. So, and they're more efficient than night crawlers as well. They want a dark, moist environment and make sure that they have air, so they're not in a sealed Rubbermaid container. They have air holes. Note though, if you're making air holes, make them high up, because if you put them too low, those worms are going to crawl out of them. So make sure you put the air holes up high so they can't get to them. We are going to make sure they have a bedding of some sort of carbon material, coconut coir, newspaper leaves, and then we're going to start by feeding them food scraps, vegan raw food scraps, just to start. To start off, we want vegan, so that's only, veggie and fruit trimmings, uncooked, coffee grounds, and eggshells. Eggshells should be kind of crunched up a bit. They do need some sort of grit in their gut in order to like eat and process the food. If you don't want to use eggshells or don't have access to eggshells, you can just use a little bit of sand, like a handful of sand or dirt, and throw that in, because that has mineral material as well. I do say vegan raw scraps because they don't really like oily things. So we don't want to use any, like oil cooked veggies. We don't want to use meat. They will eat meat, but I would say to start, especially if you don't have a really robust population, they're not going to eat it fast enough, and it's going to get nasty and rancid and maybe attract rodents. So I would avoid meat and dairy and just stick to your vegan raw scraps for now. I do know a lady, she's like the worm lady down in Pacifica. She's awesome. She throws like pretty much like everything in there, bread, pancakes, whatever. She has like thousands and thousands of worms, and she has lots of different bins. So she's kind of just experimenting. She's very experienced. So I would say to start off, just stick to your veggies and fruit scraps. They actually like fruit better too, anyway, like the sweet. They're just like us. They like sweet, easy to eat things as well. They also can be sensitive to citrus. The oils in citrus can harm their skin, so I would avoid citrus. And alliums like onion, garlic, leeks, chives, that also has an oil in that can irritate the worms. And then I said I do recommend starting with a pound of worms, which is about 1,000 worms. Worms eat half their body weight in a day, so kind of a great way to think about how many worms you need is to think about how many scraps you produce in a week. So if you have 1,000 worms, they will eat a half a pound of food a day. So you could put in 3.5 pounds of food a week, which is a pretty good amount. You can always, if you only get 200 worms in a container, you can start small. They reproduce pretty quickly. So, but just make sure you're not overfeeding them, or the food's just going to get kind of nasty and moldy, and you might attract critters that you don't want. And the optimal temperature for worms is 40 to 80 degrees. So we're perfect here in San Francisco for outdoor worms all the time. If you're out in the East Bay or in Marin, you might get some chillier or very hot temperatures. So maybe, if it's going to get really cold at night in the winter or really hot during the day, in the summertime, you might want to bring your worms inside. You can, if they're in a small enough bin, they can be under a desk, inside a cabinet or a closet. I do know someone also, she works at the Garden for the Environment. She keeps her worms just in her kitchen. So when she's chopping up a salad, she just puts her scraps right into the bin right there. Her roommates don't even notice it's there because she keeps really good care of it. So it's totally possible to have it inside all the time, especially if you don't have outdoor space. All right, we're going to talk about using our compost. I touched on it a little bit. So you can add it to garden beds and potted plants. You can either mix it into the soil before you're planting. That is a good idea. Actually, if you know you're going to plant in a couple weeks, maybe put that compost in the soil now. It's just going to increase the nutrients and microbes in the soil that will be ready for your plants when you plant. But you can add it anytime. You can also add to the soil surface, just put it, around your plants and water it in. You can also cover it with mulch, or you can just gently dig it in to that top layer. And you can use both indoor and outdoor. It can be used as a mulch around trees and shrubs. Fruit tree time is like coming up, so we can always, add a nice ring around the fruit trees we always want to do it under the drip line, not against the trunk. So, the outer edge of the branches is the drip line. So maybe put it under that outer edge, water it in, maybe put some mulch on top of it just to keep it nice and moist. You can also make a compost tea. If you're interested in this, I do recommend reading a little bit more about it because there are some extra steps to really optimize it. But compost tea is really what it sounds like. You have, a sock or some sort of tea bag, compost in it, and you soak it in water for a while. This is a picture of compost tea, or a video of compost tea that we made at my house. We used water that had been sitting out for 24 hours. So some things evaporated, some chemicals evaporated from it, and then we aerated it for 24 hours. We also added, I think, molasses or fish emulsion to it to kind of increase the sugars in there. So again, read a little bit more about it if you want to make compost tea. Compost tea is great because it can be it's basically like a liquid fertilizer. It can be used to just inoculate the soil with microbes and microorganisms and life. It can be used as a liquid fertilizer, or it can be used as a foliar spray. So sprayed on the leaves and branches of the tree. That can really actually help with pest prevention, actually. And if you're making compost, say you have a worm bin in your apartment and you don't have a garden, that's okay. You probably know people with indoor plants, people with a garden. They would probably love to give you a plant or give you some fresh veggies from their garden in exchange for some compost that you made. So there's always a way to use it. So troubleshooting our bin, just a couple of common questions that I hear sometimes. A lot of people don't like the idea of composting because they think it's going to be smelly. If it's smelly, it means you're probably doing something wrong, because properly working aerobic compost full of oxygen is not going to smell. It should smell like kind of the forest floor. If you're smelling a smell, it turned anaerobic, meaning it's not getting enough oxygen. So it's likely that it's too wet. So what you can do is you can turn the pile, add dry leaves, newspaper, carbon materials to reduce the moisture levels. If it's attracting flies or rodents, raccoons, other critters, they're probably attracted to the food scraps. So the food's probably not breaking down fast enough. There's a few things you can do. You can just take the food scraps out, stop, adding food scraps, especially if it's like a hot pile. I would probably make sure you're not adding a ton of food scraps at first, at least. You can also bury your food deeper into the pile and then cover it, especially with a carbon material, to make it less attractive and smelly. I definitely would avoid using meat and dairy in your backyard bins. That's just going to invite a lot of critters and potentially some, putrid meat and stuff that you really don't want. You can also secure your bin with hardware cloth to keep the critters out, with like a lid and secure sides. And then if you have a worm bin and it's attracting flies, again, you're probably just adding too much food for the amount of worms. So you can either add more worms or remove the food, or maybe take the food out and chop it up smaller so that they break it down faster. And if you have a pile and it's not really breaking down or breaking down really slowly, it just means that the microbiology probably isn't super active. Maybe maybe it's too cold, maybe it's too hot, probably it's too dry. If it's too dry, the microbes really slow down or die. So you want to make sure you have enough moisture in there. You can also add manure to increase the microbiology or existing compost, finished compost, or even just like grab some, fallen leaves that are kind of breaking down in the back corner of your yard, add that. That can also reignite the pile. So choosing a compost system, we're going to think about some factors. So if you're ready to do this at home, we're going to think about a few things. How much space do you have to compost? How much materials? So food scraps, how much and what kind of material? So if it's just food scraps, or do you have a yard? Do you have a huge yard that's going to produce a lot of yard waste? Or just a small yard that's only going to produce a little bit? And then time, that's how much time do you have to manage your pile or your compost system? So if you're interested in a 3-bin system or like a hot bin or hot system, I guess, again, it could be 10 bins if you want it to be, or it could be 2. 3 is, I will just share, 3 is usually the optimal because it kind of goes by phase. There's the first bin is the building phase, you're building the pile. Then it goes into the second bin, which is really where most of the breaking down happens. That's where it gets really hot in the middle pile. And then as you've moved it, you can start building another pile in the first bin. And then you continue moving it down where the third bin is the curing phase, where it's kind of cooling, finishing off. It's going to be done, and then you can move it out. It's just kind of, the 3-bin system is pretty optimal for just keeping the pile moving. That's for if you have a lot of yard debris and can fill one of those bins really quickly. It is best to start with at least 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet bin. That is going to give you at least the optimal amount of material at once. If it's too small, there's just not enough mass to really get to that temperature that you want. So as I said, it requires a lot of yard debris because you want to fill it up pretty quickly. You can use food scraps in a hot system. I do say, if you're in an urban area, be careful with using food scraps because it can attract a lot of pests. So just make sure you kind of got the system down before you introduce food scraps, or at least go slow with it. It does require more time and labor, physical labor, for chopping, moving material, aerating, sifting, but it will supply you a lot of compost in 2 to 4 months, so pretty quickly. If you have less time or less space and less material, you can choose a cold system or a passive system or a single bin. Again, we do want to kind of shoot for that at least 3 by 3 by 3 size, but the bin can be filled slowly. It can use yard debris, and again, food scraps can be added with care. If you want to put in more effort, it will speed up the process, but you don't need to. You can just toss things in, and then if you do almost nothing, 6 to 12 months, you'll have material to use. And a lot of these bins have these little doors. You can see on this bin, little doors at the bottom, so you can kind of lift up the bottom door and scoop out the more finished material from underneath. And then if you have even less space or no outdoor space, you can try a worm bin. So it can be stored inside or outside. It uses primarily food scraps, raw vegan food scraps, eggshells, coffee grounds. Really minimal effort. You do need to, build the layers, but that could be, every 3 or 4 months. It kind of depends on how you want to do it. And it will create usable compost in 3 to 6 months, and kids love it. So if you have kids, it's a great activity, poking around, seeing all the critters in there. I have some resources for you, and I can have Jen send these out at the end as well. Really wonderful book, the Rodale Book of Composting. It really goes into every detail, like the science, everything about composting. So you can really get a lot of information there. Worms Eat My Garbage. I actually have the book right here, a different version, but a great little small book primer on, everything you need to know about building a worm bin and maintaining it. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance is a great resource for learning about composting, learning about community composting, and kind of all those points that I brought up at the beginning about food waste and keeping our resources close to home. A great movie about food waste is called Wasted, Story of Food Waste. You could probably find that somewhere on the internet. And then Kiss the Ground is also a great resource. It's a book. It's a website that actually has classes, online classes, talking more about, climate change, regenerative agriculture, soil building. It's all about soil. And then there's also a great movie on Netflix that kind of talks about a little bit what I talked about with the carbon sequestration. And that's that. I thank you for being here on this Wednesday evening. My email is there, my Instagram. You're welcome to email me with questions, and I will be here also to take some questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Charlotte. That was so informative. Is everybody gonna go compost now? I think we are. I had a couple comments before we get to the questions. One thing is I definitely recommend that can of worms, that layering thing. It is easy, like Charlotte said, and I also like it because you can harvest the different layers, and the bottom layer is basically the worm pee. That's the worm juice that goes all the way to the bottom, and there's a tap at the bottom, so you can either harvest the poop or the pee very easily.
Yeah.
And so
I would just say, I don't recommend using I get questions about the liquid that comes out the bottom. Sometimes it can be, oftentimes, especially if you're like me and you don't like pay attention, it can get a little like anaerobic. So I don't actually recommend using the compost tea. Is not the same of that. That's the leachate that comes out the bottom. So what I do with it is I just like really, really, really dilute it, and I dump it in parts of my garden. But if you can make a compost tea out of like the castings, and not the pee. I didn't know it was pee.
Well, that's what I've always called it. And yeah, I do dilute it.
Okay, good.
Too. Yeah. So that's a good point. And then
I usually just leave it for too long, and then I'm like, ooh, it's stinky and smelly. So I just dilute it and push it, like drop it where my trees are. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, or if anything, it's just easy to just like drain it out, even if you're not going to use it, because it has that tap at the bottom. So
super, yeah.
And then another thing is that I noticed, or what I thought was flies, or when I got flies in the compost bin, I thought that it was a pH imbalance. So I've added ag lime before, and that's helped it.
Cool.
So that's just like another thing that you can try if that does happen.
Awesome. There's like the science of compost is like so intense. So like this was very much the surface intro, and there's like, if you want to learn about like things you can add to the compost, there's different people make like carbon heavy compost for certain reasons and nitrogen heavy compost for certain reasons. There's so much information out there. So yeah, that's awesome to hear.
I know. Well, that's what I think. It can be really overwhelming for people. So it's just kind of like, if however you can start, even if it's just putting it in the compost bin, the city municipal compost bin, because that's going to go somewhere and that's going to help. So,
absolutely.
Okay, so let's see. So there's a few questions on the manure, the layering the manure in, and can you buy Sloat sells chicken manure or steer manure. Can you like buy bagged manure and layer it in, or is that more like you want to go to a local like stable or something, or a chicken farm?
I mean, you can buy it. It's fine to buy it bagged, absolutely. It's just, you could usually get it free at a local stable or a friend with a chicken with chickens in their backyard, but and it's not going to be as fresh, so it might not be so full of the microbes, but it is definitely going to help for sure buying bagged manure. Absolutely.
And then how thick are the layers in inches? Like, say if you're doing the yard compost, the
Mhm.
bigger bins, like,
Mhm.
is each layer like 6 inches, or what is it? Does it depend?
So it doesn't really matter. It's not really like building layers. It's more just, I said layer it in because you have to have I mean, sorry, you don't have to have one. The recipe is more in parts. So for example, at the GFB, they have these big buckets. Once there's one bucket full of green waste, they dump it in, and then they'll dump in 2 buckets of like wood chips or something, for example. And I've seen it done at other community composting sites where it's like, 1 tub of food scraps and 2 tubs of wood chips. And then they kind of throw it in. And as they're building the pile, they're mixing it in already. So you're not really like, the layers are more just like for visual effect. And as you're building, it's probably going to be in layers. But then eventually you're going to pull it out and you're going to mix it all together because you do want it mixed. So it's really in parts, not necessarily like inches.
Okay, got it. Um, tumbler style compost bins, we didn't really talk about those.
Yeah.
Is that, and I don't know either. I've never used it myself, but I guess you're
I
just tumbling it, every day or two, and then
yeah. So
check it a little. I don't know.
I have seen successful compost come from a tumbler.
Hmm.
It's not my favorite method. I know it can be very like clean and look really nice. It is actually a lot harder to tumble it than you think. Like, it still requires a lot of energy to turn it, especially if it's really a lot of food in there or material. The thing to think about, if you have a tumbler, it can get hotter because it's not on the ground, it's kind of off the ground, and it can get colder. So if you're in a climate where it freezes, it could freeze. And it has no contact with the ground. So you have to make sure you're adding microbes of some sort. So you can add manure, you can add other compost from like another pile, you can add leaves from the garden, but it doesn't already, if you're just putting food scraps into a tumbler, it's just going to turn into a big old rotten mess. You have to include other materials and might introduce microbes to it. So that's where I've had, like, for example, my mom has one. And she was putting in her food scraps and leaves and stuff, or maybe not leaves, but food scraps, and nothing was happening. It wasn't necessarily turning rotten, but nothing was happening. So she had another compost pile. So I just had her put like a scoop of her compost in from the other pile, and it really started up and it's got going. So you just have to, I think it just requires more monitoring than people think. Because it's like contained off the ground.
Yeah, that makes sense. Side note, Sloat does sell Compost Maker, which is kind of like
Mhm.
those microbes in a box. So so it is easy. You can just sprinkle it in.
Mhm.
And then we also sell the worms too. I don't think we have them right now, but just because it's a little off season, but we should be getting them in the next, I would think, week or two, as it starts warming up. So
Awesome.